Wonderful, thanks so much. I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, great. Thank you so much to the conference organizers and our panel chair, Dr. Urbanik, and warm greetings to the attendees who are with us today. My name is Brittany Fox-Williams, and I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Lehman College, City University of New York, and I'm joining you today from the Bronx. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you a paper I co-authored with my colleague, Lisbeth Trilogy Loft at the University of Copenhagen. The title of this paper is Should I Tell Anyone? Heterogeneous Youth Stigma Responses in the Aftermath of Involuntary Police Contact. Involuntary police stops, that is, stops that are initiated by police officers, have become an increasingly common experience for adolescents living in urban communities in the United States. This is due in large part to the rise of order maintenance policing practices and school-based policing programs. Not only can these encounters be traumatizing experiences for young people, studies show that they are associated with adverse developmental outcomes for youth. Research also indicates that involuntary police stops can serve as stigmatizing events that disrupt the emotional well-being and behavioral beliefs of adolescents. At the same time, adolescents vary in how they process their experiences, and we predict that involuntary police encounters are no different in that regard. This last point really undergirds our motivation to investigate the heterogeneous stigma responses of youth. A growing body of research demonstrates that involuntary police encounters can have negative implications for the development of young people, especially as it concerns their academic performance, legal socialization, physical and mental health. In terms of academic performance, studies show that personal and vicarious police stops are associated with reductions of self-reported grade point averages. Research also suggests that the involuntary police contact that young people experience is associated with heightened feelings of legal cynicism. And even beyond legal cynicism, involuntary police stops may lead young people to detach themselves from key institutions, including those that provide essential medical care. Moreover, studies connect these interactions to lower self-rated physical health and adverse mental health outcomes, including anxiety, post-traumatic stress, and depression symptoms. Involuntary police contact can also lead to feelings of social stigma among youth. Sociologist Erving Goffman defines stigma as a deeply discrediting attribute that diminishes an individual from a whole and usual person to a tainted, discounted one. These discrediting attributes can be visible or invisible, and linked to one's appearance, group membership, behavior, or prior experiences, such as criminal justice contact. The concept of social stigma also captures the feelings of shame, biased beliefs, and discriminatory treatment individuals experience due to their discredited identity. It is important to note that stigma is rooted in social context and depends on unequal power relations. As Link and Phelan emphasize, it takes power to stigmatize. The criminal justice system represents one such institution that has the power to stigmatize, including through seemingly low-level encounters between police officers and urban youth. In the present study, my co-author and I offer a conceptualization of social stigma in the criminal justice context that acknowledges the harm of seemingly routine interactions, highlights heterogeneity in youth experiences and perspectives, and identifies salient conditions associated with stigma among youth. So the research questions guiding the study are threefold. The first question asks, how do urban youth experience social stigma in the aftermath of involuntary police contact? Second, to what extent is there heterogeneity in their stigma responses? And finally, what individual and context level factors contribute to heightened feelings of social stigma among youth? So now I want to talk a little bit about the data that we use to answer our research questions. So our data come from the Fragile Family and Child Wellbeing Study. The Fragile Family Study is based on a stratified, multi-stage sample of nearly 5,000 children born in large US cities between the years of 1998 and 2000. It's also important to note that births to unmarried mothers were oversampled by a ratio of about 3:1. The fragile family sampling strategy, as you can imagine, resulted in the inclusion of a large number of Black, Latino, and low-income families. The publicly available data thus far includes 6 panel waves, and our analysis largely focuses on the year 15 survey, which includes questions about young people's involuntary police contact. 918 young people who reported ever having been stopped by the police comprise our study sample. Okay, so this table here provides a descriptive overview of the full year 15 sample in comparison to our study sample, which is highlighted by the green box. Our study sample, right, the 918 youth respondents who reported ever having police contact, has a larger proportion of Black and other race youth and are less likely to identify as female. Moreover, the mothers of these young people are less likely to have had some college education, and their families were more likely to be in poverty at the time of their birth. Okay, so now I want to move into a discussion about our estimation strategy for answering our research questions. So our estimation methods take a 2-step approach. In the first step, we use latent class analysis formulated as generalized structural equation models to group adolescents by social stigma response type. Next, we ran a multinomial logistic regression to examine how individual level and police encounter level factors are associated with the likelihood of belonging to each of the identified stigma response types. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're actually measuring stigma and those response types. Our measure of social stigma is broken down into 2 related but distinct components: external social stigma and internal social stigma. External social stigma includes 5 survey items that capture the actual and perceived discriminatory treatment young people experience in the aftermath of an involuntary police encounter. Examples include item 3, right? People have used the fact that you were stopped to hurt your feelings. Another example is item 5, people have avoided you. Okay, now I want to draw your attention to the internal social stigma components, which include 6 survey items that describe feelings of shame stemming from an involuntary police stop and the anticipation of discrimination that prevents young people from disclosing their experiences to others. Examples include item 7, you sometimes hide the fact that you were stopped from your friends and family, and item 11, you would be less likely to apply for a job if you knew that the employer would ask about your past experiences with the police. Now let's move into our study results. And on the next slide, we're going to take a look at that heterogeneity that I've been talking about in youth stigma responses. So this table presents the results of our latent class analysis. The first column labeled sample, right, which you see highlighted in that red box there, represents the mean distribution of each external and internal social stigma component of our analytical sample of 918 adolescents stopped by the police at some point. And it basically functions as a baseline comparison. All right, so I now want to draw your attention to the second column that's highlighted, labeled Class 1, which represents a little over 19% of our analytical sample. So adolescents belonging to this class have a relatively higher likelihood of experiencing both external and internal social stigma components in the aftermath of an involuntary police stop compared to the sample means. We label this class higher, as you see at the bottom of the column. Now, turning to class 2, we find that 36% of youth in our analytical sample respond to this class. Class 2 is typified by a greater likelihood of experiencing only internal forms of social stigma. And you also see that we label this class as internal. And then adolescents belonging to the last class, class 3, which is highlighted in green, have no greater likelihood of experiencing external or internal stigma following an involuntary police stop. Rather, the respondents in this class all exhibit markedly lower probability of experiencing any of the social stigma components, and we label this class lower for that reason. This stigma response class represents about 45% of the adolescents in our analytical sample. And having shown that heterogeneity exists in how social stigma manifests itself in the lives of youth following an involuntary police encounter, we're now going to examine if adolescents systematically sort into these three different social stigma response types or classes based on individual level characteristics and also encounter level factors. So this next table that we're looking at reports the results of our multinomial logistic regression analysis, where the lower stigma response group, also known as class 3, right, that last class that was highlighted in green, that serves as our reference category. So I'd like to draw your attention to the relative risk ratios under the columns labeled with like the triple R at the top. And I first want us to focus on those police contact variables. All right, so just as a note, right, as we're interpreting these relative risk ratios, keep in mind that a relative risk ratio above 1 indicates increased odds or likelihood of being in the stigma response class in question, right, that particular column we're looking at, versus the lower class. On the flip side, a ratio below 1 indicates decreased odds or likelihood of being in the stigma response class in question, again, in comparison to the lower class. This first set of estimates that we're looking at, highlighted with the red box, focuses on the encounter level factors. So adolescents undergoing greater levels of intrusion during a police stop are on average more likely to belong to the higher stigma response type and the internal response type, although to a lesser degree. Whether the police found anything illegal or issued a ticket during a stop is also a significant factor in whether adolescents experience social stigma. Although I do want to note that only 15% of the respondents actually reported that anything illegal was found by the police or a ticket was issued during the stop that they experienced. Now moving into the individual level factors that shape youth social stigma responses. As we see from the age at police stop variable, every 1 year increase in age reduces a respondent's likelihood of being in the higher social stigma response type on average. So in other words, this means that younger adolescents tend to experience greater feelings of social stigmatization in the aftermath of a police stop. Okay. So next, we see that adolescents who identify as Hispanic or Latino experience on average an increased likelihood of belonging to the internal social stigma class in comparison to the lower response class. And socioeconomic background is also a significant factor for sorting adolescents into the higher social stigma response type. So relative to adolescents with college-educated mothers, adolescents born to mothers with high school education or those born to mothers with less than a high school education are more likely to experience the higher social stigma response type. And finally, adolescents with a relative household income below the middle percentile have a likelihood of experiencing the higher social stigma response type. So on the next slide, I want to take a moment to really re-emphasize our findings here and also to discuss the implications of this research, right? Why this work matters. So emerging research on involuntary police contact has deepened our understanding of how such encounters shape the daily lives and futures of young people. In this study, we direct our attention to the variation in how these experiences manifest themselves in the lives of urban adolescents, with a particular focus on social stigma. We identified 3 distinct types or classes of social stigma responses from young people following an involuntary police encounter, which we termed higher, internal, and lower. And we also demonstrate that the intrusiveness and character of a stop together with key demographic and socioeconomic factors, predict heightened social stigma responses. This study ultimately sheds light on the fact that involuntary police stops, even in the absence of an arrest, can stunt the development of youth by influencing their conceptions of self, their behavior, and even their future prospects. Moreover, these experiences can lead to a double marginalization of racialized youth who already endure racial stigmatization in their lives. Future iterations of this work will examine the school and community contextual factors that can help protect young people from heightened social stigma responses. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I welcome your questions and comments during the Q&A portion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Fox-Williams. That was excellent. So up next, we have Dr. Kanika Samuels Wortley joining us from Carleton University, sharing a talk on Canadian youth perceptions of the police, a quantitative analysis. Now, if you're joining us from YouTube or if you're in the Zoom chat, of course, we welcome all questions from all attendees. Please use the chat function to enter questions, and please hold that off until the very end. So once we're done with everyone's presentations, we'll open it up for questions. Dr. Samuels-Wortley, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much for that. I'm just going to take a second to share my screen. Okay, thank you. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you all from my home, which is located on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nations and the traditional home to the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples. I acknowledge that as a non-Indigenous person, I am privileged in a privileged position as a researcher on speaking on Indigenous issues, which I will be doing today. Therefore, I'm always open to hearing feedback from Indigenous peoples if my research in any way impacts their communities. So my name is Kanika Samuels-Wortley, and I am an assistant professor at Carleton University at the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice. And my scholarship centers the intersection of race and racism in the criminal justice system. And part of this research examines perceptions of and experiences with the police among Black, Indigenous, and white youth in Canada. So today's presentation speaks to a larger mixed method study exploring confidence in Canadian law enforcement, but I will focus on the quantitative data from this study. Discussing race and racism is controversial and emotional in Canada, as our identity is rooted in our commitment to multiculturalism and the belief that diversity is our strength. As such, both nationally and internationally, we are seen as a nation that is more racially tolerant than the US, and thus have escaped the ills of racism that has contributed to gross racial disparities in the American criminal justice system. The truth, however, is that exploring the impact of racial discrimination in the Canadian criminal justice system is not an easy task. Historical, formal, and informal bans on the collection of race-based data, as well as the power of Canada's multicultural narrative, has made it difficult to examine the intersection of race, racism, and the functionality of the Canadian justice system. And later, I will discuss some of the barriers I faced to access data used to conduct the present study. I will continue with a brief discussion of the relevance of exploring racial bias in policing. I will identify the study's research question and then briefly explain the methodology used to explore youth perceptions of the police. I'll discuss the study's findings and limitations, and finally, I'll turn to future areas of research. Policing is a particularly important criminal justice institution to explore, as the initial point of contact with the community and the almost unlimited discretionary powers to interpret and enforce the law. Police are the coercive gatekeepers to the justice system. Therefore, critically examining the role of policing in modern society and knowing how citizens perceive and experience law enforcement officials has captured mainstream interest. Perceptions of the police are consistently identified as an important academic area of study. Research suggests that citizens who have negative perceptions of the police are less likely to report criminal activity and cooperate with police investigations. Furthermore, negative perceptions of the police may lead to distrust in the overall criminal justice system, as well as other social institutions. A growing body of research suggests that negative perceptions of the police may reduce citizen compliance with the law, and a growing number of scholars maintain this may be particularly relevant within racialized communities. These scholars argue that direct and indirect experiences with racial discrimination can erode confidence in the criminal justice system and contribute to perceptions of social injustice. Perceptions of social injustice, in turn, may directly influence decisions to engage in criminal behavior. International studies demonstrate that perceptions of the police are lower among youth and adults and are particularly low within racialized communities. By contrast, little is known about racialized youth perceptions of the police within the Canadian context. So there is an importance in the story as hearing the voices of racialized peoples to understand how contextual factors like experiences and perceptions of racial discrimination with law enforcement officials may impact racialized youth's livelihood is necessary. For example, the story can shed light into how experiences with racial discrimination may impact how youth view their role and opportunities within society and ability to navigate in comparison to their white counterparts, as we just learned from Dr. Fox-Williams' presentation. It is true that quantitative data cannot capture the everyday experiences of racialized people. However, quantitative methods are required to document widespread statistically significant racial disparities within the justice system, including policing. These statistics can counter the state argument that justice is race neutral. Incorporating quantitative methodologies can highlight the structural barriers and inequalities that differentially impact racialized groups, allowing for a balanced exploration into these complex issues. So this too is important when exploring confidence in the police among youth populations. So for the following study, I asked, are racialized youth, particularly Black and Indigenous youth, more likely to report negative perceptions of the police in comparison to their white counterparts? And I also explore other theoretically relevant factors such as gender, neighborhood, experiences with victimization, and police contact, and whether that too can influence perceptions of the police. So to examine whether there are racial differences with respect to youth perceptions of the police in Canada, I use quantitative data drawn from Statistics Canada's General Social Survey and conduct both bivariate and multivariate analyses to examine the impact of race on public perceptions of the police, as well as other theoretically relevant variables. The point of the inquiry is to establish whether Indigenous and Black youth are more likely to report less confidence in the police in comparison to white youth by using a large random and verified sample of the Canadian population. The quantitative analysis presented today is based on telephone survey interviews with youth respondents aged 15 to 24, and this subsample includes 2018 respondents. So I gained access to the full data set, which is not available to the general public. A public version of the data set includes most measures, but excludes desegregated racial categories. In the public data set, respondents are identified as either white, Indigenous, or a visible minority. Thus, it's impossible to explore perceptions of Black peoples in Canada or any other racial minority group without accessing the full restricted General Social Survey data. So gaining access to the full data set was not easy. I had to provide fingerprints, photos, my passport information, and my marriage certificate to the RCMP, which is Canada's National Police Force. Analysis could only be conducted at the Research Data Center at a Canadian academic institution, and no information could be released without an additional vetting approval from a Statistics Canada research analyst. So consider that this is the process required to simply examine the relationship between race and perceptions of the police. This underscores the challenge of gaining access to race-based data in Canada. Those who critically examine quantitative techniques, including quantitative critical race theorists, would argue this process alone demonstrates how powerful government institutions create systematic barriers to public data that could help examine and better understand racism in our country. So my analysis is guided by previous studies that have used the General Social Survey to explore perceptions of the police within the general Canadian population. In this survey, respondents are asked to rate how good a job they believe their local police service is doing in 6 areas, including enforcing laws, promptly responding to calls, supplying information to the public on how to reduce crime, ensuring safety, being approachable and easy to talk to, and treating people fairly. The responses to these items are used as my dependent variables and examine differences between views of Indigenous, Black, and white Canadian youth. The following chart examines the relationship between race and each police measure by presenting odds ratio as generated through a series of bivariate logistic regression models. In general, the data suggests that Black and Indigenous youth are less likely to believe that the police are doing a good job in comparison to their white counterparts. Black youth score lower on each of the 6 policing measures than white and Indigenous youth. However, racial differences only reach statistical significance for perceived enforcement of the law, responding to calls, and treating people fairly. For Indigenous youth, the only significant difference between Indigenous and white youth is with respect to responding to calls. Overall, the odds of a Black youth reporting that the police do a good job enforcing the law is 54% lower than white youth. The odds of a Black youth reporting that the police do a good job responding to calls is 49% lower than white youth. And the odds of a Black youth reporting that the police do a good job treating people fairly is 55% lower than white youth. The odds of an Indigenous youth reporting that the police do a good job responding to calls is 47% lower than white youth. So besides race, my multivariate analysis controls for variables that are known to impact perceptions of the police. Previous research suggests, for example, that victims of crime evaluate the police more negatively than non-victims. Previous research also suggests that frequent contact with the police can lower confidence in law enforcement. I also examined whether gender, geographic location, perceived neighborhood safety, and neighborhood willingness to report crime impact attitudes towards the police. The data indicate that these control variables are also related to race. My bivariate results suggest that both Indigenous and Black youth are more likely to report recent victimization experiences than white youth. Victimization is particularly high amongst Indigenous youth. Black and Indigenous youth also report higher levels of police contact than white youth. Indigenous youth are more likely to report living in a rural area than their Black and white counterparts. And racial differences do not exist with respect to any other control variables. Generally, all youth report feeling safe in their own neighborhood and believe their neighbors would report crime to the police. Previous studies using the General Social Survey to explore police perceptions found the most significant differences for visible minorities were with respect to approachability and fairness. Thus, the author suggests the 2 questions regarding interpersonal interactions with police may be especially important for visible minority groups. The other measures were then grouped to create a scale that examined perceptions of the police based on technical aspects of policing. So I followed the same logic. Thus, to evaluate interpersonal perceptions, a scale was created by combining being approachable and easy to talk to, as well as treating people fairly. The combined scale ranges from 0 to 4. So the higher the number, the more positive respondents feel about interpersonal perceptions of police. To evaluate technical perceptions, a scale was created by combining enforcing the law, promptly responding to calls, supplying information to the public to reduce crime, and finally, ensuring safety. The combined scale ranges from 0 to 8. The higher the number, the more positive respondents feel about technical perceptions of the police. So the following table here presents 2 regression models, one for the interpersonal interaction scale and one for the technical ability scale. For any quants that are here, I should mention that these are survey-weighted bootstrapped linear regression models. Both models control for respondents' race and the control variables described above. The results suggest that female youth, and that's language coming from the General Social Survey, and respondents who report that their neighbors would report crimes score significantly higher on the interpersonal scale. By contrast, victimization is negatively related to scores on the interpersonal scale. Finally, Black youth score significantly lower on the interpersonal interaction scale than both white and Indigenous youth. The second model reveals that respondents who feel safe in their own neighborhood and those who believe their neighbors would report a crime score higher on the police technical abilities scale than others. However, youth who report living in urban areas and those who report higher rates of victimization score lower on the scale. As with the interpersonal scale, Black respondents score significantly lower on the technical ability scale than their white and Indigenous counterparts, even after controlling for other factors. It's interesting to note that contrary to other Canadian and American research, police contact is not a significant predictor on either scale. I suspect this may have to do with the nature of the police contact variable, as the GSS measure, in my opinion, does not adequately distinguish between positive, negative, and neutral interactions with the police. So in sum, these regressions suggest that Black youth are significantly less likely to report positive perceptions of the police than white youth. However, the data somewhat surprisingly suggests that differences between white and Indigenous youth are not significant. And I do want to comment on the potential relevance of this finding. So consistent with previous research, this study demonstrates that victimization is a strong, significant predictor for police confidence. So those who report victimization have significantly lower perceptions of police. Victimization has been identified as an important contextual factor to explore, as the role of police is directly related to assist those who are in distress or victims of a crime. Thus, they argue that individuals who experience victimization are more likely to have contact with police. Following this logic, victims of crime may be more apt to evaluate police performance. Canadian data consistently demonstrates that Indigenous peoples are disproportionately represented in crime victimization data. And the current study may demonstrate that victimization among Indigenous youth is an important factor when exploring perceptions of the police. Both Indigenous and some non-Indigenous researchers and activists have argued for the need to explore the relationship between experienced violence and intergenerational trauma among Indigenous populations in Canada. They argue that physical, sexual, and emotional abuses that took place in state-sanctioned residential schools from the late 1800s to the late 1990s contributed greatly to the risk of violent victimization within Indigenous communities. This holds significance as Indigenous youth have expressed concern over non-Indigenous police officers' lack of knowledge of Canada's colonial history and its subsequent impact on Indigenous communities. So a variable that may explain why the Indigenous race variable is not significant in the multivariate analysis is the impact of the urban-rural residents. The results suggest that a higher proportion of Indigenous youth reside in rural areas, and rural youth are more likely to report positive perceptions of the police. This leads to an important question about Indigenous policing. Could Indigenous-led responses increase positive perceptions of the police among youth? Unfortunately, research into Indigenous policing is one of the least studied areas in Canadian law enforcement, but this deserves further attention. This may lead to further discussions about the importance of culturally relevant responses. And this too may be relevant to address when exploring law enforcement interactions within Black communities. So according to the General Social Survey, overall perceptions of the police among youth are favorable in Canada. However, the results also indicate that Black and Indigenous youth have less confidence in the police than their white counterparts. After controlling for relevant factors such as gender, geographic location, victimization, and perceptions of community safety, the race effect disappears for Indigenous youth but remains significant for Black youth. Thus, the variables included in the regression model do not fully explain the negative perceptions of Black youth, the negative perceptions that Black youth have of law enforcement. Therefore, this speaks to the importance of qualitative data. Without qualitative data and the inclusion of Black youth voices, we lack a full understanding of why Black youth have more negative perceptions of the police. When looking at the analysis itself, there are some limitations. The study demonstrates that victimization is a strong, significant predictor of confidence in the police. In general, those who report higher rates of victimization have more negative views of police than those with low levels of victimization. My bivariate analysis suggests that Indigenous youth report higher rates of victimization, but I do not conduct a moderation analysis to explore whether victimization may be differently related to perceptions of the police across racial categories, which would have allowed insight into whether experiences with victimization may explain why Indigenous youth have less confidence in the police than white youth. Furthermore, I do not conduct a moderation analysis to explore whether rural status may be differently related to perceptions of the police across racial categories. This is important to explore as my bivariate results suggest that Indigenous youth are more likely to report living in rural areas, and my multivariate analysis suggests rural youth are more likely to report positive perceptions of the police. So this may be reflected with experiences with Indigenous-led responses. So the question is, do Indigenous youth who have Indigenous-led responses in their communities have better perceptions of the police? As such, the relationship between geographical area, race, and perceptions of the police should be explored further. Regardless, the study does establish that even when controlling for other theoretically relevant factors, Black youth in Canada are consistently less likely to report positive perceptions of the police in comparison to their white counterparts. So when it comes to examining youth perceptions of law enforcement in Canada, race matters. However, to have a nuanced understanding of these perceptions, future studies should also employ quantitative methodologies to help identify both trends and understand the lived experiences of those who face racial discrimination from law enforcement officials in Canada. Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you for that really interesting talk and sharing that data set with us, Dr. Samuels Wortley. I particularly appreciated how well your talk complemented our previous talk shared by Drs. Fox-William, and I am certain that the subsequent talk is also going to help us build a really robust foundation. Again, if you're joining us from YouTube or if you're here live with us in the Zoom chat, I welcome you to submit any questions you might have in the chat. We are holding off for questions at the moment, but I will invite all questions when all the speakers are done with their talks. So last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Scot Wortley presenting some work he has done with Dr. Akwasi Owusu-Bempah. Both of these scholars are from the University of Toronto, and their talk is called Meet the New Cops, Just Like the Old Cops, Race, Police Stops, and Perceptions of Anti-Black Police Discrimination in Toronto, Canada, over a quarter century. Whenever you're ready, Dr. Wortley.
Thanks, Marta. And I just wanted to state that it's kind of a privilege to be presenting with the other speakers on a topic that I think complements the work that's already been presented here this morning. I'm going to run through, we've got a number of different findings to review. So rather than spend a long time on the theoretical background, which I think has been adequately addressed, I just want to talk a little bit about the issue of allegations of anti-Black racism within Toronto, particularly those leveled against the TPS. There is a long history of community allegations, followed typically by criminal justice denials and subsequent government interactions. Sorry, my mother is coming in here right now. So these are often followed by, based on periodic media-driven crises regarding police treatment. Over the last 25 years, we've seen allegations of police abuse of force, allegations of discrimination with respect to police surveillance strategies, including stop and search practices. Most recently manifest through a series of articles by the Toronto Star and their analysis of what has been termed police street check or carding data. Often what we get following these crises is promises of police reform, promises that the police will analyze, review these issues, only followed by relative inaction, and the crisis cycle emerges. The most recent manifestation of that crisis, I would say, has been the emergence of the BLM movement, not only in Toronto, but across Canada, which hit a high following the murder of George Floyd in the United States, that corresponded with a number of controversial police-related deaths in Toronto and other areas of Canada. So really what we've got is a continuing cycle of allegations of racial bias on the one hand, denials and inaction on the other hand, and very little research due to what Kanika, Professor Samuels Wortley already identified as a great challenge in terms of accessing race-based data to analyze these emerging research questions, much as they have been analyzed in the United States. So research questions that I want to address today. We often have statements, particularly over the last decade, that things have changed dramatically. I've got to say, when I started this work in the 1990s, I would talk to police officials and they would say, listen, we're doing better. It's much better in the 1990s than it was in the 1960s or the 1970s. When you talk to police officials these days, you tend to get, well, believe me, it's much better now in 2022 than it was back in 1990. So there are always claims and that things are getting better, that community relationships are strengthening, and that any bias in the system is being eliminated. But we want to see whether that reform movement or that reform ethos has actually taken hold with respect to public perceptions of the police, in particular public perceptions of racial bias in policing. Has it changed over the past 25 years, despite or consistent with police claims and government claims that great reforms have taken place? And similarly, we know, as Brittany mentioned and as Kanika mentioned, these racial perceptions or race-based perceptions are often strongly linked to both direct and vicarious experiences with the police. So we're going to look at one particular type of activity that is being stopped and searched by the police, and whether or not that has changed and the racial disparities declined over the past 25 years. The surveys that I'm going to focus on actually took place over a 25-year period. The first survey was conducted in 1994. At that time, I was a graduate student and a researcher with the Commission on Systemic Racism in the Ontario criminal justice system. The commission was receiving a great deal of flack and public outrage directed at the then NDP government led by Bob Rae. The allegations were that this was an unnecessary government exercise, that this was Canada, that racism did not exist. We were a bastion of multiculturalism. And there were many police officials, including the head of the Toronto Police Service at the time, Bill McCormick, who made statements that this commission and this research was unnecessary and being driven by radical elements within the NDP. I thought at the time that it would be therefore a good idea to actually conduct a study on the perceptions of the police stratified across racial lines. The chief did say that in his experience, the vast majority of the Black community in Canada had complete 100% trust in the police, and that these commission was being driven by a few radicals like Dudley Laws. So we decided to conduct this survey, I believe the first of its kind in Canada. It was conducted by the York University's Institute for Social Research. And this survey involved a random sample of individuals identified as Black, white, or Asian. These were the three largest racial groups in the Toronto area at that time. And due to financial constraints, we could only focus on three racial groups, although it would have been great to focus on all the groups that make up Toronto's multicultural fabric. The second survey, we received funding to complete this survey by the Social Sciences Research Council of Canada, and we conducted that survey in 2007. And finally, in 2019, Akwasi and I received funding from the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers to replicate the survey. Surveys 2 and 3 are replications of Survey 1. This enables a trend analysis to determine whether perceptions and experiences have changed over the past 25 years. Survey 1 and 2, methodology and the challenges of conducting survey research have definitely transformed over the last 25 years due to the advent of cellular technology. Surveys 1 and 2 were conducted using the standard kind of random digit dialing technology that was used back in those days. Survey 3 used an online panel design. All three surveys involved samples, as I mentioned, of approximately 1,500 respondents. A stratified sampling strategy was used to ensure an equal number of interviews were conducted with people who identified as Black, white, or Asian. And a comparison of respondent characteristics with census estimates reveals that all three surveys are representative of Toronto's Black, Asian, and white communities. Some of the major findings overviews, all three surveys found that in general, Torontonians evaluate the police more highly than the criminal courts. However, Black and Asian respondents are more critical of the police and less critical of the courts than white respondents. White respondents are often critical of the courts with respect to their perceived leniency in criminal sentencing. By contrast, white respondents are less critical of the police and more critical of the courts. I should stress, however, that we ask a variety of different types of questions about the police. And it should be stated that despite some of the findings I'm going to present shortly, the majority of Black respondents in our sample and respondents from all three groups believe the police are doing a good or average job at most of their routine activities, including patrol, keeping the community safe, communicating information about personal safety. However, where the huge racial disparities emerge is with respect to perceptions of bias. So the question, first of all, is have perceptions of racial bias changed over the past 25 years? I recall, the statement by Chief Bill McCormick that the majority of people in the Black community back in the 1990s had complete trust with the police, was kind of blown up by the findings of this survey. We found in this survey of over 500 Black individuals that 76% of Toronto's Black community perceived that the police treated Black people worse or much worse than they treated white people. And that this perception was shared by a large proportion of the white and Asian communities. And indeed, it's not isolated within the Black community. 50% of white respondents back in 1994 also felt that Black people were treated worse by the police. We also, by the time we presented this study in the early 2000s, it was interesting. We would often get statements that, well, if you did the survey again, you would get dramatically different responses because of our community policing efforts, our diversity hiring, our anti-bias training. We've really made major reforms recently, and this has changed the platform. When we replicated the study in 2007, that's not what we found. We found, in fact, among the Black community that perceptions of police bias, anti-Black discrimination had increased from 76 to 81% over that 13-year period. And it actually also increased among the white population, that they had increased from 51 to 59%, had dropped slightly among Asians. And again, we replicated this survey in 2019. And I should stress that this was before the George Floyd case and the subsequent social movement. So there's no evidence that these perceptions were impacted by that event. And again, we see a rise in the perception of anti-Black discrimination among the white respondents from 51% in 94 to 61% in 2019. And similarly, the perception of anti-Black discrimination has increased in the Black community, if anything, over this time, not decreased. So despite reform efforts, there's very little evidence to suggest that perceptions of anti-Black racism and policing have declined. We've also asked this question of police treatment versus Asian people. What we found over these 3 years is a relatively stable perception of anti-Asian discrimination in the white community. It's remained about 26%. So white people are much more likely to perceive racism against the Black community than against the Asian community. Interesting enough, it has risen quite significantly in the Asian community. Back in 1994, less than half of the Asian community perceived anti-Asian discrimination in policing. This has risen to 58% by 2019. And perceptions of anti-Black racism anti-Asian discrimination in policing have actually declined significantly among Black respondents. It was interesting, back in 1994, Black respondents were more likely to perceive anti-Asian discrimination than actual Asian respondents, where that situation has reversed itself since then. I'm just going to quickly run through some of these findings. We asked the same questions about sentencing within the courts. Again, we see no evidence that perceptions of racial bias with respect to criminal sentencing have declined. Although white respondents tend to perceive less anti-Black racism in the courts than they do in policing. And we see a dramatic increase in the perception of anti-Black racism within the courts from 48% to 79% among our Black respondents during this period. Once again, we see lower perceptions of anti-Asian discrimination in the courts, although these perceptions are increasing quite dramatically from 18 to 39% in the Asian community and from 30 to 42% among our Black respondents. One of the questions, and Brittany's presentation, nicely demonstrated this, is the impact of police experiences, both direct and vicarious, on perceptions. So one of the hypotheses that emerges is that these perceptions of police bias are based on actual experiences. This argument is supported by Toronto street check data. I'm showing one chart here. Street checks were involuntary police contact, where individuals are stopped, questioned, often searched, and their information recorded in a police intelligence data set. These were non-criminal encounters where charges did not take place. The Toronto Star data, which we are currently reanalyzing, revealed immense racial disparities with respect to police recorded contact. These are the rates for Black males, 15 to 24 years old, by race between 2008 and 2013. I should state that during this period of time, the Toronto Police conducted over 2.2 million street checks, or over 400,000 per year, and that the street check rate in Toronto was actually higher than the stop and frisk rate of the NYPD during the same period of time. And you can see that during this period of time, there's about 9 street checks for every 1 Black male in the 15 to 24-year-old category during this period of time, compared to 1.4 for individuals identified as white. What has happened most recently is, as allegations of racial profiling emerged, we had, for the first time, I think, strict regulations brought about to control police behavior, the Ontario street check regulations, which have led to the question on whether or not street check regulations have actually reduced or eliminated involuntary police contact or police surveillance of minority communities. The official police data show dramatic declines. You can see the numbers, I can't see the numbers at the bottom, but we'll see, up to 2012, there was 403,000 street checks recorded by the Toronto Police. Once this became a controversy, the Toronto Police reviewed their practices, and there was a dramatic decline down to 189,000 in 2013, down to 24,000 in 2014. In 2017, the street check regulation was implemented, and there were only 25 officially recorded street checks. So we went from over 400,000 down to 25. And more recently, the recent numbers from 2019 indicate that only 1 street check was eliminated. And this is often used to argue that issues of racial profiling are now in the past. 2018, there was 2 people stopped. They said 1 was white, 1 was Black, therefore there's no racial disparities. This finding, however, does not mesh with what we are finding in our surveys with respect to self-reported police contact. So we asked everyone, how often in the past 2 years have you been stopped and questioned by the police? And you can see that if anything, racial disparities in self-reported police contact have increased over this period of time. In 1994, 16.8% of our Black respondents reported that they'd been stopped and searched by the police over this period. That rises to 26% in 2019. So there is a disconnect between what we're seeing with the official street check numbers and what these self-reported surveys result. And this does demonstrate, I think, that street checks are not officially recorded police stop and search activities. Street checks were had a very special definition. And I think although street checks have been eliminated, it has very little to do with respect to police surveillance, as indicated by stop and search practices. And until we start to measure those things, we're not going to be able to fully imagine or understand the impact that police activities have. More recently, we know, we legalized cannabis in Canada starting in 2018. A very peculiar law that came into play in Ontario was a law that allows the police to fully search vehicles and all occupants if they suspect that there's an open container of cannabis within the vehicle. Many lawyers that I've been talking to recently are complaining that this new provincial law is now being used to justify stop and search activities that are manifesting the same racial disparities as we saw under street checks, only justified under trying to prevent driving while intoxicated on cannabis. But these actually being pretextual stops where the real reason is searching for guns and other contraband. The multivariate analysis, I'm not going to present it, but we have a paper coming out in Policing and International Journal shortly where this information is provided. There's also a report on the cable website that we produced for cable that has these analysis. Racial differences in perceptions of criminal injustice remain strongly significant after controlling for other theoretically relevant variables, including age, gender, immigration status, employment status, household income, education, community crime and disorder, criminal record, drug and alcohol use, and direct and vicarious experiences with the justice system. Both direct and vicarious experiences, including self-reported stops and searches, have a strong positive effect on perceptions of criminal injustice. One thing I want to mention is immigration status. The police will often have told us that one of the reasons that Asian and Black people have more negative views of the police is because they have they're coming from other countries, that they're immigrants to Canada, and they're basing their experiences on their countries of origin. I can tell you that those perceptions are absolutely incorrect. Those with the most positive views of the Canadian criminal justice system and policing are new immigrants. Those perceptions erode the longer that you've been in the country, and the groups with the most negative views of the justice system are Black Canadians who were born and raised in Canada. Also, racial differences in police stops and searches cannot be explained by variables including poverty, criminal record, drug and alcohol use, leisure activities, or community crime and disorder. Basically, to conclude, the evidence suggests that race still matters just as much today as it did 25 years ago with respect to not only perceptions of the police, but also self-reported experiences with the police. Despite various government inquiries and anti-racism initiatives, perceptions of racism in the justice system are just as strong, if not stronger, in 2019 as they were in 1994. Efforts at reform appear to be ineffective at increasing community trust and confidence. Perceptions of anti-Black racism have increased significantly among both white and Asian people in Toronto. Will this increase the political will to enact meaningful reforms? I mean, this might be a cause for optimism. That allyship, particularly on this issue, seems to be growing throughout the Canadian population. Furthermore, after decades of denial and censorship, governments are now mandating for the first time the collection of dissemination of race-based data in policing and hopefully the broader justice system. I've probably seen more movement in the last 3 years on this issue than in the previous 25 years. We need race-based data to identify racial bias, evaluate the effectiveness of anti-racism efforts, and increase police accountability. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Wortley, for that talk and sharing some of those really intriguing findings with us. I'm glad I was correct that all of the talks on this panel really wed together quite nicely and were able to bring out some of the nuance in experiences and perceptions of policing, including amongst some marginalized individuals. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to go to the chat. I see that the chat has been popping off with questions for all of our speakers, and I'm really eager to get into them. So I'll open that up and I'll read questions both for Brittany and Kanika and for Scott. If you are watching us from YouTube, again, I'd like to invite you to put any questions that you might have that you've been holding off into the chat there, and our fantastic grad student assistant today, L'Oreal and or Ashley, will be tossing those my way. So let's start with the first question here. So the first question is for Brittany. This YouTube viewer says, very important study. Considering the data sample is from 20 years ago, do you imagine these findings would apply today, or would you speculate any differences in youth experiences of stigma with police?
Thank you so much. I appreciate this question because it allows me to clarify the data set that we're working with. So fragile families, the young people who are the targets that we're looking at, were born between 1998 and 2000. But in fact, the actual year 15 survey that we're focused on happened between 2013, 2015, when they were about 15 to 18 years old. So in fact, the data are not stale. And Fragile Families is actually doing a year 22 follow-up with these young people. And so my co-author and I and many others who use the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing data set are really excited to see what's going to happen with this next survey wave when it's released. So I do appreciate the question. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks for that. Yeah, I'm curious if you did have more dated data, whether there would be some variations in your findings as well. But I'm looking forward to seeing how you compare upcoming findings. Okay, so next question is for Kanika. This is also a question from our awesome YouTube viewers. The question says, does the Indigenous sample acknowledge Indigenous populations who live on reserve, or does it conflate rural with reserve? If so, do you imagine you would see a different outcome between Indigenous people living on reserve as compared to rural? Contextualizing this notion with research that shows rural communities tend to be more conservative and tend to support police presence more than those living in city areas.
Yeah, that's an excellent question and excellent point raised when looking at the relationship between political orientations and geographic location. So I will say that there may be differences, and the GSS does conflate rural and Indigenous communities. So where the notion is made that there might be an increase in positive perceptions of the police in relation to youth comes from a Feathers of Hope, a report which was conducted by the Ontario Youth Advocate, the former Ontario Youth Advocate, in 2014. They led an incredible study and initiative that looked at Indigenous perceptions of law enforcement, and one of the areas that they examined was in particular to Indigenous policing. And a number of youth expressed that they felt that when they were dealing with enforcement officials who were in fact Indigenous and who engaged in culturally relevant forms of engagement, felt that they had a better connection with those officials. So the idea that there may be a benefit in exploring culturally relevant forms of engagement with youth comes from that study, but also a number of other studies that have looked at rural policing, in particular a study that was done by Rose Ricciardelli at Memorial University, who is one of few to look at youth perceptions of the police in rural communities. And it also includes an Indigenous sample, and Rose, as well as her colleagues, also found that there were an increase in positive perceptions of the police. But I certainly don't want to group all Indigenous youth into one, as communities are not a monolith. So it is very important to explore different perceptions and ideas and experiences. But the General Social Survey data does suggest that there is importance in looking at geographic area.
Great, thanks for that. That's really clarifying. I appreciate it. Okay, so our next question is for Scott. This is a question from YouTube, and Celine is posing this question to you. So the question is, have you examined neighborhood differences as a variable in your analysis, especially when you think about Toronto's community housing neighborhoods?
We've examined it in two ways. We do ask a specific question about whether you reside in public housing. And definitely individuals who reside in public housing have more contact, stop and search activities with the police. We've also looked at communities with respect to a scale that we've produced on crime and disorder. So we ask about 10 different questions about the perceptions of various crime and disorder problems within your community. We currently have postal code information that we're going to try to match to kind of census level descriptions of the communities that individuals reside in. But an important caveat is that you might expect, for instance, among the Black population to see a decline in perceptions of injustice amongst those who are affluent, highly educated, high income, live in affluent neighborhoods, and we don't see that at all. In fact, if we see the opposite with respect to both perceptions of injustice, those who are highly educated those who have high incomes, who are employed long-term, actually have worse perceptions than those who are coming from marginalized communities. Often because they're arguing, I've done everything to be a success, I'm doing everything right in society, and I still experience race as a master status that dictates how I'm going to be treated by the police. We also find, consistent with a lot of American research, that Black individuals who reside in predominantly white affluent communities are actually more likely to be stopped, questioned, and searched by the police than those who reside in poorer neighborhoods. Consistent with what has been termed the out of place hypothesis.
Thanks for clarifying that, and for kind of also tying that to the driving while Black perception, right? Sometimes, which I learned actually first in your class many, many, many years ago at U of T. And Celine, thanks for asking that question. That's also so near to my heart. Okay, so moving on to the next question. The next question is for Brittany. And this, I believe, is a question from YouTube. This individual wants to know, in terms of age increases, seeing a difference in stigma perception, would this have controlled for police interactions over time? In other words, a youth interacting with police for the first time at age 17 compared to a youth who has interacted with police since age 14, do you imagine a difference in stigma perception?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's a great question, actually, but it's a little less straightforward for me to answer because of the structure of our police stop variable. So Fragile Families asks young people to describe their most memorable police stop when they're sharing their reactions around social stigma. And so for a young person, that could have been their first and only stop. And for another young person, that could have been their 50th stop, right? We have a range of like 1 to 50 stops for these young people. And young people have been stopped between the ages of 8 to 18. So if we're talking only about the most memorable stop, I think we could theoretically extrapolate that an older adolescent would have a less stronger stigma response, right? But if we had potentially gotten survey data or stigma responses to every stop that a young person experienced, it's not entirely clear what that would have looked like.
Yeah, it'd definitely be interesting to see how that might change some of the findings and add greater nuance there. Thank you for that, though. Okay, we have another YouTube question. This time it's for Kanika, and this question is from Celine. Thank you, Celine, for your questions. Celine wants to thank you for your presentation first, and then wants to know, what are some of the limitations you found with utilizing the GSS to conduct statistical analysis on a criminological topic like perceptions of the police?
Yeah, that's another great question. So the limitations of the general social survey is that the variables used are not comprehensive. So looking at the data from Dr. Fox-Williams, you see that there's an ability to go deeper into some of the questions that are explored among the youth sample that was just reviewed in her presentation today. So when looking at perceptions of the police and specifically looking at contact with police, as previous data, previous research in the US has demonstrated that previous contact with police is a significant predictor in determining perceptions of the police and more likely to report negative perceptions of the police. And that case wasn't found here. And I think it certainly has a lot to do with the way that we look at contact with police within the general social survey. So they look at contact with police based on public information, traffic violation, whether being arrested, emotional alcohol abuse, or whether a family member was engaged in a mental health incident. So this does not address a number of other forms of police contact, including involuntary contact, which is a significant issue for racialized youth. In particular, when you're looking at qualitative data, examining experiences with the police, a lot of Black youth indicate that they experience involuntary, their stop and search incidents, as was discussed in Dr. Wortley's presentation. That is what has a significant impact on perceptions of the police, why they are being stopped, and the perception that they're being stopped in essence because of their race. That is not explored in the general social survey, and therefore doesn't provide context to how a particular type of police contact may relate to reporting a certain a level of confidence in the police. So I think it is important to ask more comprehensive questions, and as Dr. Fox-Williams mentions, looking into the most memorable form of police contact that can bring up a lot of information and context. And therefore, I think that at times using quantitative data, and particularly big public data sets, doesn't go deep enough into issues that pertain to perceptions of the police.
Perfect, great. Yeah, I totally agree. And what I really appreciate from your presentation is, again, highlighting the need for both quantitative examinations and, that some of the richer, more qualitative stuff. So it's really great to wed the two. Okay, we have another question from YouTube. This question is for Scott, and it comes from John Sewell. The question is, since more data isn't changing the racial discrimination by police, what do you suggest should be done to make change?
Oh, do you have 3-4 hours? I mean, that's a huge question.
We have 8 minutes.
Yeah, I do think, we've had a lot of discussions, and I hope that Dr. Fox-Williams and Dr. Samuels Wortley can also, kick in here. I do think the data needs to be part of systematic data collection. I mean, we're doing a survey outside the system, and I think that public opinion surveys are not viewed with the same level of respect, for instance, that the police view their own data. Their own data is often viewed as a form of intelligence that is not to be shared with the public, at least in the Canadian context. My experience is, to get hold of this data, you need to fight tooth and nail. In the Toronto context, for instance, I think communities have been calling for at least 20 years for the collection of data on stop and search activities, recording, much like it has been in Great Britain, much like it has been in many jurisdictions in the US. And the police and police associations have fought tooth and nail to try to prevent that. Recently, I've heard that discussions might be opening up, but I've heard that the TPS only wants to collect data on traffic stops that are successful. So stops where they actually find something, or stops where they level a ticket, which is going to leave out those vast majority of proactive, investigative stops that are most consistent with racial profiling, where nothing is uncovered. I think we need, right now, there's a lot of discussion of collecting race-based data on both victims and offenders. In the Canadian context, very little discussion is on collecting data with respect to discretionary police decision-making. So continued data collection on use of force decisions, arrest decisions, diversion decisions, traffic stops. I also think, there needs to be public disclosure of this data. I think that, looking at things like internal benchmarking to identify the bad apples, or whether or not these are systemic practices, need to be identified. And we need greater civilian oversight. I think Canada has a lot of performative aspects of civilian oversight, working with complaints commissions. At least now you can complain and file a complaint with an independent civilian oversight agency in most Canadian jurisdictions, but largely the investigations are turned back to the police themselves, who treat it as they always have. I think that tighter civilian oversight is required. But I do hope that we move in this direction of data collection, because I think data collection in itself can produce some change. But I always find there's, there's movement around. I mean, the whole street check issue I found flabbergasting, because it's almost bamboozling the public into thinking because street checks are gone, other forms of police surveillance have been eliminated, and that's not the case at all. And I think there's a little bit of deflection involved there. So I don't know if Dr. Fox-Williams or Dr. Samuels Wortley have any other things to add to that.
You've certainly summed it up, and I think I absolutely agree with everything you've said there. And speaking once again to the importance of race-based data, I think it's important to have and be to show accountability to the public is to have access to both police data as well as looking at public surveys that look at experiences with victimization, crime and victimization. And the reason is just because we do know that police data can represent biased data. It focuses on areas that the police are focusing on. It doesn't look at the experiences of other individuals in other areas where crime is taking place, but police simply may not be there. And then we see an overrepresentation of individuals and communities where the police are there. So it is important for us to have a nuanced and complex and comprehensive understanding, as we need to have race-based data that comes from both the police as well as public surveys.
And I also just like to add a note here, and I think a lot of this was covered by Dr. Wortley and Dr. Samuels, but I think it's important that in addition to having the data, right, the data matter, our analyses matter, but I also think political will matters, right? And so we have to think about the work that we do as social scientists as being connected to social policy. And I think that also kind of speaks to the work that our disciplines need to do to get involved in social policy, informing the work of policymakers and developing that political will to want to make the change. Because you could have, you know, millions of miles of data, right? But it really won't make a difference unless it's getting into the hands of the right people who can make that affirmative change.
I did want to add, to John's comment that, the data collected hasn't changed anything. I think it has changed things. I mean, I thought one of the more remarkable findings from our surveys are the increase in white and Asian respondents who have now identified anti-Black racism as an issue. Is that going to push the political envelope and produce the political will when it's not only the Black minority that is making these claims, but also, we've got over 60% of white Torontonians now are believing that the police treat Black people worse. What is the political implications of that? And I think that it does show, and I think a lot of that might be the release of the data and the media discussions of the data that had so long been, thwarted. I mean, the fact that the Toronto Star had to go through a 2-3 year legal battle, costing thousands of dollars just to get the street check data, is a remarkable Canadian story. And similarly, I don't think that resistance has evaporated. I think the political will now is for victimization data and offending data, which could be used, unfortunately, as a way of justifying racially disparate police treatment. So.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm so grateful for this really rich discussion between our presenters. We did have one more question, but unfortunately we are a little bit short for time, so I'd like to kind of move on from that. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers for a really invigorating discussion and for starting off this conference after a keynote on such a positive, strong note. I'd also like to thank Jeff Broussard for all his hard work pulling this all together and doing all of the behind the scenes important stuff. And of course, our great grad students, Ashley Cole and L'Oreal Giffen, for all the hard work in terms of moderating questions. At this time, I'd also like to thank all of our viewers on YouTube for tuning in and watching. I know this was a lively, invigorating panel. I saw that there was quite high viewership numbers thus far, and I'm looking forward to seeing those numbers only increase. I'd also like to take the time to welcome you all to the next session happening after this one. We have about 20 minutes before that starts. That one starts at 11:20 Mountain Time, and that one is called Policing Borderlands and Foreign Lands. Again, I'd like to thank you all for your time and invite you to attend the rest of our conference. Thank you.